The lawyer had just asked me to confirm my full name for the record, and I had to smile at that. 64 years of life, 31 of them spent inspecting industrial work sites across northern Ontario. And I was sitting in a Sudbury law office being asked to confirm who I was, as if I'd forgotten. I hadn't forgotten anything. That was the problem. My name is Kenneth Ford, and 3 weeks earlier, while I was lying in a hospital bed at Health Sciences North with 2 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, and a grade 2 concussion from a fall off an icy loading dock, my son-in-law had called me a liability, not to my face. He'd said it to my daughter in the hallway outside my room, not quite quietly enough, that I'd become a liability and that it was time they started thinking seriously about next steps. I heard every word. My daughter Carolyn, she didn't correct him. That was the part that stayed with me long after the bruising faded. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, which is with the phone call I was on when the lawyer's assistant knocked to tell me my daughter had arrived. 3 hours before that meeting, I'd been on a video call with a man named Stuart Vance. Stuart runs a mid-sized property management company out of Hamilton that oversees residential and light commercial buildings across southern Ontario. A former colleague of mine, a man I'd worked alongside for years doing safety compliance work, had put us in touch. Stuart's firm had been looking for a minority investor with industry knowledge, someone who understood building codes, maintenance liability, infrastructure risk, someone whose background could add value beyond just capital. I'd spent 31 years being that person for other people's companies. It turned out I could be that person for my own investment too. Stuart had asked intelligent questions. He wasn't trying to flatter me into anything. He asked about my understanding of WSIB obligations, about my familiarity with municipal inspection protocols, about whether I had contacts in the trades. I answered honestly. We talked for nearly an hour. At the end of the call, he said, "I'd like to move forward, Kenneth. My lawyers will send over the structure this week." I thanked him and closed my laptop. Outside the window of my house in Liability, the snow was coming down the way it does in February, sideways, indifferent, like it had somewhere else to be. My wrist still ached where the bone had knit itself back together imperfectly. My ribs caught if I breathed too deep. But my mind was clearer than it had been in months. Carolyn and my son-in-law, his name is Ryan Mercer, and I'll use it because he's earned the use of it. They didn't know about Stuart Vance. They didn't know about a lot of things I'd been doing in the 6 weeks since I'd been discharged from Health Sciences North. What they knew was that their names were still in my will. What they assumed was that nothing had changed. People tend to assume things when they think they have the upper hand. Let me go back to the hospital. It's important to understand what happened there, because everything that came after grew from those 12 days. I'd been doing a favor for an old friend that November morning, helping him inspect a loading bay at a warehouse just outside Espanola. It was early, the dock was iced over, and I slipped. Simple as that. No drama, no villain, just a patch of black ice, and 64-year-old knees that didn't react the way 30-year-old knees would have. I went down hard and landed badly, and by the time the ambulance got to me, my wrist was at an angle it had no business being at, and every breath felt like swallowing glass. Carolyn came to the hospital that first evening. She sat with me for about 40 minutes, asked the nurse a few questions about the discharge timeline, and then said she had to get home because Ryan needed the car in the morning. She kissed my forehead. She told me to rest. She left. She came back once more, 4 days later, briefly, and only because I'd texted asking whether she could bring me a phone charger. She dropped it at the nursing station and didn't come up to the room. The rest of the 12 days I was alone. My nurse, a woman named Donna, who had the particular brand of no-nonsense warmth that I've only ever seen in people who've worked too many overnight shifts in underfunded wards. She noticed. She didn't say anything for the first week, but on day 8, when she brought my evening medication, and I was sitting in the dark with the television off, she said quietly, "Is there someone I should be calling for you?" I told her there wasn't. She sat down in the chair beside my bed, which I don't think nurses are really supposed to do, and she said, "You have a daughter listed as your emergency contact. She hasn't called in 5 days." "I know," I said. "I've been counting too." Donna looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I've seen a lot of families come through here. The ones that surprise me aren't the ones that stay. It's the ones that don't, and then act surprised when things change." I didn't know what she meant yet, but I would. What I didn't know during those 12 days was what was happening outside the hospital. I found that out later, through a retired investigator named Gordon Chafe, who a friend of mine had used years ago during a property dispute. Gordon was thorough, professional, and had the kind of manner that made you feel like nothing he uncovered would shock him. Some of what he found shocked me. Ryan had called a real estate agent 11 days after my accident, not to ask about market conditions, to ask about listing a property, my property, the house in Liability that I'd owned outright since 2009, the one I'd finished paying for 2 years after my wife passed, the one with her rose garden along the back fence that I'd never once touched because I couldn't bring myself to. The agent had pulled comps. The house would list between $480,000 and $510,000, depending on the season. Ryan had asked whether spring or early summer was the better window. The agent had said June was usually strong. This conversation happened while I was still in hospital. Gordon's report also covered Ryan's financial situation in more detail than I'd expected. He and Carolyn carried $54,000 in combined credit card debt. Their mortgage in Sudbury was $2,400 a month, and they were 2 payments behind. Ryan's income had dropped significantly in the past 18 months because his contracting work had slowed. He ran a small renovation company that had lost its 2 biggest commercial clients. Carolyn worked part-time at a dental office. Together, they were barely keeping the lights on. I was not unsympathetic. I had lent them money. Twice. The first time was $22,000 to cover a tax bill Ryan hadn't planned for. The second was $18,000 to help with the mortgage when the commercial work dried up. Both times I'd asked only that they pay me back when they were able. Both times I'd received a signed acknowledgement. Not because I was suspicious, but because my wife had raised me to document financial agreements even within families. She'd seen enough cousin disputes over undocumented loans to know better. Neither loan had been repaid. I hadn't pressed it. Gordon's report also included something I hadn't asked for, but that he'd included anyway, flagged with a note that said he thought I should know. Carolyn had been in contact with a family lawyer in North Bay. The inquiry was framed as estate planning advice, specifically asking what protections existed for an adult child when a surviving parent began making major financial decisions, and whether a capacity assessment could be requested, and by whom. She was looking into having me declared incompetent. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I closed the laptop and sat in my kitchen and looked out at the rose garden, buried under 2 feet of February snow, and I thought about the woman who had planted it. My wife Elaine. She died of pancreatic cancer 7 years ago. Quick and brutal, the way that particular disease tends to go. She'd been 61. She'd been sharp and funny and completely unimpressed by nonsense. She'd loved Carolyn fiercely and without condition. I wondered what she would make of this. I thought I knew. I thought she would say, quietly, in the way she had, "Kenneth, you know what you have to do." I did know. I called Gordon back the next morning and asked him to continue monitoring. I called my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Mullen, who'd handled my estate documents for 15 years and who did not rattle easily. I asked her to begin drafting revisions to my will and to set up a living trust structured so that any future capacity challenge would have nothing to challenge. Everything legal, everything documented, everything locked. And then I called Stuart Vance. The investment closed in mid-March, 18% equity in Vance Property Management, with a seat at the quarterly advisory table and full voting rights on acquisitions. Stuart had been more than reasonable. He'd said my industry background was worth as much to him as the capital, and I believed him because he'd demonstrated it in every conversation we'd had. Patricia filed the documents the following week. The will revisions took longer because I wanted them right. Everything: the house, the investments, the RRSP. A small commercial property in Sudbury I'd bought as a rental 15 years ago. Everything went to two places. The Sudbury Community Foundation, earmarked for a trades training fund in Elaine's name, and a nephew of mine in Calgary, Elaine's sister's son, a young man named Andrew, who worked in pipeline safety, and who had driven 8 hours to sit with me for 3 days when I was in the hospital, unasked, unbidden, just because he'd heard I was alone. Carolyn's name did not appear. Ryan's name had never been there to begin with. Patricia reviewed everything twice, brought in a second opinion, and told me it was airtight. She said if there was a capacity challenge attempted, any court would look at the documentation trail and see a man who had been making deliberate, well-advised financial decisions over a period of months. There was no angle. Good, I said. That's the point. Here's the thing about waiting that nobody tells you. It has a texture to it. Those weeks between the moment you've set everything in motion and the moment the other person finds out. It's not pleasant exactly, but it's clarifying. I went to my follow-up appointments. I did my physiotherapy exercises. I answered the few calls Carolyn made, which were brief and administrative in tone, asking how my wrist was, whether I was managing on my own. I answered honestly and warmly and gave nothing away. Ryan called once the second week of April. He asked how I was feeling. He asked whether I'd given any thought to the future, whether I'd considered that the house might be getting to be a lot to manage on my own. I told him I was managing fine. I thanked him for asking. After I hung up, I sat for a moment. Then I called Patricia and told her to move the meeting to the following Thursday. The morning of that Thursday, I drove myself to Patricia's office on Elm Street. My wrist had healed well enough for driving. My ribs no longer caught when I breathed. It was a cold April morning, the kind that reminds you that in northern Ontario, spring is less a season than a rumor. I wore a good jacket and took my time getting up the steps. Patricia had arranged for Carolyn and Ryan to receive a letter that week. It was worded carefully. It informed them that as part of a comprehensive estate and financial review, there would be a family meeting at the offices of Mullen Law on Thursday, April 17th at 10 o'clock, and that their attendance was requested. The letter did not mention Stuart Vance. It did not mention Gordon Chafe. It said only that there were matters pertaining to the estate that required discussion. I was already seated when they arrived, 7 minutes late. Carolyn came in first. She looked tired and something else, wary, maybe, or braced, the way a person looks when they're not sure what they're walking into, but they've prepared their face for it. Ryan came in behind her with his shoulders forward, the posture of a man who's decided to be on the offensive before anyone said anything. He shook Patricia's hand and then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach anything above his chin. "Kenneth, good to see you up and around." I told him it was good to be up and around. Carolyn hugged me briefly, her arms not quite committing to it. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn since she was 19, and for a moment that was the hardest part. Just that small familiar thing. We sat down. Patricia opened her folder. Her voice was even and professional, the voice of someone who has delivered difficult information to families for long enough that she no longer braces for the reaction. She began with the investment. She explained that in March, I had made a significant equity investment in a property management firm, representing a reallocation of capital that had previously been liquid in registered accounts. She noted the investment was performing well and that the advisory structure gave me ongoing professional engagement, which was both financially and personally beneficial. Ryan's expression shifted, just slightly, just at the corners. He glanced at Carolyn. Patricia then outlined the living trust. She explained its structure, its purpose, its terms. She explained that the trust was designed to hold my primary assets, the house, the investment, the rental property, and that as trustee I retained full control during my lifetime. She explained that the trust's terms were specifically structured to survive any external challenge, and that 2 independent legal reviews had confirmed this. Ryan leaned forward. What kind of external challenge? Patricia looked at him. Any kind, she said, including a capacity application. The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape to it. Carolyn's face had gone still. Not blank. I know my daughter well enough to read her, but still, the way a face goes when the mind is moving fast, and the body hasn't decided what to do yet. Ryan, to his credit, or perhaps just to his nature, recovered faster. He said, Kenneth, I think there may have been some misunderstanding here. We've just been trying to look out for you. I let him finish. Then I said, I know about the real estate agent, Ryan. He opened his mouth. I said, I know about the call in November. I know about the comps. I know about June. He closed his mouth. I turned to my daughter, Carolyn. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, and I couldn't tell yet whether it was genuine or whether it was fear wearing the costume of grief. I said, I heard what Ryan said outside my hospital room. I heard the word liability. I heard next steps. I want you to know I'm not angry about it. I'm disappointed, which is worse. But I'm not here to punish you. I'm here so you understand that what you were planning isn't going to happen. The house is in the trust. The investments are in the trust. The rental property is in the trust. Everything is documented. Everything is legal. And there is nothing to challenge. Ryan said, You can't just cut your own daughter out. She hasn't been cut, I said. She's been treated the way she treated me, which is to say, she'll receive what I choose to give, when I choose to give it, based on the relationship we managed to build from here. He started to speak again, and I held up my hand. I said, You signed promissory notes for $40,000, Ryan. Both of them. Patricia has copies. The formal demand for repayment will be issued by this office within 30 days. You can arrange a payment schedule with Patricia directly. The color left his face in a way that reminded me of a wall when you strip the paint. Carolyn said quietly, Dad. I looked at her. I'd loved her since before she was born. Since the day her mother and I sat in a Sudbury parking lot after the ultrasound, too stunned and happy to drive home. I'd loved her through bad decisions and good ones, through a marriage I'd had reservations about, through years of small distances that I'd told myself were normal, were fine, were just the way adult families grew, I said. I'm still your father. That hasn't changed. But I am not the person you were planning around. I am not a timeline, or a listing price, or a number on a balance sheet. I'm 64 years old, and I have a great deal of life left, and I intend to spend it in my own house, with my name on the deed, with Elaine's roses in the backyard. If you want to be part of that life, I'd like that. But it has to be a relationship, not a calculation. She was crying by then. I don't know what the tears were for. Maybe she didn't either. People are complicated, and my daughter is more complicated than most. Ryan said nothing else. He gathered himself, straightened his jacket, and left the meeting ahead of Carolyn without another word to me. She stayed a few minutes longer. We didn't say much. She asked whether I was well. I told her I was better than I'd been in months. She nodded. She left. Patricia poured 2 cups of coffee, and we sat for a moment in the quiet. She said, That was handled with considerable restraint. I said, I've been at a lot of termination meetings. You learn that the room gets smaller when voices get louder. She smiled. What happens now? I told her I didn't know. I told her that was all right. That evening I drove home in the last of the April light. The lively streets were still patchy with old snow in the shaded spots, but the bare ground was showing through. In another month, the rose garden would be brown sticks poking out of mud, and in another month after that, if the season was good, the first leaves would come. Elaine had planted that garden the summer Carolyn turned 4. She'd done it on a weekend in June, on her knees in the dirt, with a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old's worth of supervision. Our neighbor's son had wandered over to help, which mostly meant handing her the wrong tools. She'd laughed the whole time. She'd said, Kenny, nothing worthwhile grows fast. You just have to be patient with it. I'd thought about that a lot in the past few months. Gordon Chafe called me that evening with a final update. He said Carolyn and Ryan had driven directly from Patricia's office to their house, that there appeared to be a significant argument in the driveway based on what the neighbor had later mentioned, and that Ryan had packed a bag and left by early afternoon. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. It wasn't what I'd intended, but then I hadn't intended any of this. I'd intended to retire quietly, to volunteer with the Mindset Safety Board, to learn how to make Elaine's butter tart recipe the way she'd tried to teach me 4 separate times without success. None of that had changed. Only the people I'd need to navigate around had shifted. Andrew called from Calgary that night. He'd heard through Elaine's sister that there had been some kind of family meeting. He asked carefully whether I was all right. I told him I was all right. He said, "I can come out this summer if you want company." I said I'd like that. After we hung up, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the lights on and the snowmelt dripping off the eaves outside. The house was quiet in the way it gets when you've lived alone long enough to stop noticing the silence. I'd spent months being afraid of that quiet, filling it with worry about Carolyn, about the loans, about the slow creep of distance between us that I'd kept telling myself I could still reverse. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I thought about what Donna, my nurse at Health Sciences North, had said on day 8. The ones that surprise me aren't the ones that stay. It's the ones that don't, and then act surprised when things change. Things had changed. Whether Carolyn would change along with them was not something I could decide for her. I could only decide what I was willing to walk toward, and what I was willing to leave behind. I'd made those decisions carefully, with documentation and witnesses, and 2 legal reviews, which might sound cold but is actually just what it looks like when a man who has spent 31 years making sure other people's workplaces were safe turns that same careful attention on his own life. I was still her father. That was true and would stay true. But I was also Kenneth Ford, former senior safety inspector, current minority shareholder in a property management firm, owner of a house on a street in Liability, Ontario, with a rose garden that would bloom again in July whether anyone was watching or not. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough.